Mud clung to their boots like a second skin, the weight of the earth itself dragging them down. The spring of 1945 had not come with blossoms for the men of the Wehrmacht, but with surrender, silence, and the hollow echo of defeat. Along a country road in Germany, lined with trees just beginning to bud, a column of German generals marched beneath the watchful eyes of their American captors. They had once stood at the center of maps crowded with arrows, symbols of strength, commanders of divisions and armies. Now they shuffled in muted disgrace, their polished insignia dulled by rain, their once proud medals catching only the faintest glint of a gray and unwelcoming sky. The war was over for them, though the sound of it still haunted the air. In the distance, one could still hear the rumble of artillery like a dying heartbeat, and above, the faint whine of Allied planes tracing the horizon. But here, on this narrow road, the drama was stripped bare. These were not titans of strategy, nor masters of conquest. They were prisoners. Their eyes darted sideways, toward ditches, toward trees, toward the guns of their guards, as though every moment might be their last. Some expected summary execution. Others dreaded humiliation more than death. All of them carried the same thought, unspoken but burning: how far they had fallen. History had trained them to expect the worst. In their minds lived memories of old tales, Napoleonic officers shot in ditches, whispers of what the Soviets were doing to captured men of the Reich. The threats Adolf Hitler himself had spat in his final days, that the enemy would show no mercy. The generals had commanded men into battle with those words ringing in their ears. Now, stripped of command, they feared those prophecies might prove true upon their own bodies. It is one thing to speak of honor and sacrifice in the echo of a war room. It is another to feel one's life reduced to the pull of a trigger held by someone who once seemed less than an equal. The Americans who guarded them were young, their faces sunburned, their uniforms mud-stained. To the Germans, they seemed almost casual in victory. Their rifles were steady, but there was no fire of vengeance in their eyes. Only the practiced vigilance of men who had seen too much death already. The contrast was unbearable. The generals had been raised on images of Americans as decadent, soft, incapable of discipline. And yet, here they were, shepherded like sheep by boys who chewed gum as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Every step was a humiliation. Each crunch of gravel beneath their boots a reminder that the Reich had promised triumph and delivered nothing but ruin. For some, memories of the Reich's glory days burned even more painfully than the present humiliation. They remembered parades through conquered cities, the sea of saluting arms, the intoxicating illusion of permanence. Those parades had ended in mud, in hunger, in the long road of retreat across Russia, France, and now their own homeland. A few still wore the Iron Cross pinned to their tunics, the symbol of a martial heritage stretching back a century. But the cross had become a weight, its meaning corroded. What did courage mean when their Führer lay dead in a bunker, when cities burned, when their armies surrendered by the millions? The Iron Cross had once been an emblem of power. Now it was an anchor dragging them deeper into shame. Among them walked men of varying temperaments. One, gaunt and sharp-eyed, muttered prayers under his breath, his lips moving silently. Another, stocky and red-faced, clenched his jaw so tightly that blood rose in his cheeks, his fury barely contained. A third marched with surprising calm, his face a mask of resignation, as though he had rehearsed this moment in his mind for months. Each carried private ghosts. Each imagined the end would come differently. Yet none could escape the same slow realization. They were no longer actors in history, only its subjects. Once the world had bent around their decisions. Now their lives belonged to the whims of strangers. As the road curved, the Americans barked orders, and the Germans obeyed. That, too, was new. Men who once commanded thousands now following the clipped instructions of sergeants scarcely in their 20s. The power dynamic was naked, unashamed, almost mocking in its simplicity. To resist was unthinkable. To surrender with dignity seemed impossible. So they trudged onward, locked in the silent war of their own thoughts. Pride clashed with terror in their chests, neither willing to yield. This was what defeat looked like. Not a single shattering blow, but a slow erosion. The grinding humiliation of each passing moment. The countryside mocked them with its peace. The fields were green, untouched by shells, dotted with farmhouses that stood stubbornly intact. Somewhere, a dog barked. Children's laughter carried faintly on the wind. It was a cruel irony. The war had brought fire and ruin to so many cities, but here the rhythms of rural life seemed to beat on undisturbed, as though the apocalypse of Europe had been nothing but a storm passing on the horizon. The generals noticed, and the bitterness rose like bile. Their war had been total, all-consuming. Yet for the Americans who now held their fate, war seemed a matter of duty, not ideology. That difference cut deeper than any insult. They thought of their families, uncertain if their wives and children lived or starved, if their homes still stood. The silence of capture was worse than any battlefield chaos. There were no radios here, no couriers, no certainty. Each general carried not only his own shame, but the gnawing weight of unanswered questions. Would history remember them as villains, as fools, as relics of a madness they had served too faithfully? Or would their names dissolve into the dust of archives, forgotten by the very nation they had pledged to serve? That uncertainty was its own punishment, heavier than chains. The march ended not with the crack of rifles, but with the creak of a gate. They were led into a makeshift compound, little more than a farm repurposed for war's leftovers. Wooden fences, a barn, a yard with trampled grass. It was absurd in its simplicity, this place of captivity. They had expected steel, stone, perhaps barbed wire curling like a crown of thorns. Instead, they found the ordinariness of rural America. The shock was almost unbearable. Was this how their enemies truly lived? Was this the empire that had crushed them? Fields, barns, and boys with chewing gum? Night settled slowly, the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and gray. The generals sat together, silent, staring at the horizon as if it held answers. The Americans brought water, bread, even blankets. The prisoners accepted them with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from disbelief. Every kindness was a dagger, each gesture of civility a reminder of what they had been told to expect and what they now endured instead. They could not decide if it was mercy or mockery, and yet, deep down, a sliver of something dangerous stirred. Curiosity. If this was not the vengeance they had feared, then what was it? The night closed in, and with it came the realization that their fate was no longer theirs to command. Execution had not come, at least not yet, but neither had clarity. They were alive, sitting on American soil, offered food instead of bullets, blankets instead of chains. Their world had collapsed, yet some unknown new order was taking shape around them. In the silence, the question pressed down heavier than any weapon. What awaited them in the hands of these unlikely victors? The answer would arrive soon, in the most unexpected form, at a dinner table. Dawn broke with a softness the generals had not expected. No blaring horns, no barking orders, only the lowing of cattle and the faint whistle of wind moving across open fields. They had been moved under cover of night, guided onto trucks that rattled across unfamiliar roads, until at last they jolted to a stop. When they climbed down, their boots met not the stone of a fortress or the barbed wire of a prison camp, but damp earth beside a white farmhouse with a red roof. The air smelled not of smoke or gunpowder, but of cut hay, fresh soil, and something else, a hint of coffee drifting from an open window. The American guards called it temporary holding. To the Germans it felt absurd. Generals who once plotted campaigns stretching across continents were now deposited like stray animals into the backyard of a family farm. A wooden fence circled the property, a token barrier more suited for pigs than prisoners of war. Beyond the yard, fields rolled out in gentle waves, dotted with corn sprouting green and barns painted with the stubborn pride of rural America. The juxtaposition gnawed at the Germans. For years, they had been told the Americans were a nation of consumers, weak and flabby, incapable of discipline. Yet here stood the proof of a different strength. Fields that fed armies, barns that sheltered grain and cattle, a quiet abundance that made mockery of scarcity. The farmer emerged mid-morning, a tall man with shoulders bent not from fear, but from decades of labor. His overalls were patched at the knees, his hands broad, calloused, and stained with soil. He carried himself without ceremony, as though the sight of German generals on his land were no stranger than stray cattle wandering into his fields. Behind him appeared his wife, apron tied neatly, flour dusting her sleeves, her expression cautious but not hostile. Two children peered from behind her skirts, their eyes wide with the innocent curiosity of those too young to understand the weight of history unfolding in their yard. The Germans stiffened instinctively, prepared for ridicule, for gloating, for the sneer of victors at the fallen. None came. The farmer regarded them with the same look he might have given a broken plow, something inconvenient, but manageable. His wife set down a basket on the porch. Inside lay bread, apples, and a pitcher of milk, condensation beading on the glass. The generals exchanged glances, disbelief flickering in their eyes. Was this a test? A cruel trick? No one moved until one of the Americans motioned brusquely, "Eat!" With hands reluctant and clumsy, they obeyed. Bread torn between fingers once used to hold maps of conquest. Apples bitten into by jaws clenched against shame. Milk swallowed in gulps, its sweetness unfamiliar after months of rations and bitterness. The humiliation was sharper than any insult, yet beneath the humiliation stirred a reluctant gratitude. Hunger does not care for pride, and pride bends quickly when the stomach demands. For the first time in months, they tasted food that did not come from tin or moldy stockpiles, but from earth tended with patience. What unsettled them most was the normality. Children giggled as they chased each other through the yard, their laughter carrying across the silence like birdsong. The farmer scolded them gently, then went about stacking hay near the barn, his rhythm steady, his indifference striking. It was as if war had paused at the fence line, leaving this patch of earth untouched. For men who had marched through scorched villages and hollowed-out cities, the existence of such calm felt almost obscene. Here, life had not collapsed. Here, bread was still baked, milk still poured, and children still laughed at the edge of the world's greatest catastrophe. One of the generals, a man with silver in his hair and hollows beneath his eyes, finally spoke. His voice cracked the silence. "Why are they feeding us?" His words were meant for his comrades, but the question lingered in the air. None had an answer. According to the Reich's propaganda, Americans despised Germans, lusted for revenge, sought only to humiliate and destroy. Yet here they were, offered sustenance by the very people whose sons had bled against them at Normandy, whose planes had bombed their cities into rubble. It defied reason. Suspicion gnawed at them. Perhaps this was psychological warfare, an effort to soften them before interrogation. Yet suspicion could not entirely shield them from the dissonant warmth of bread fresh from an oven. That afternoon, the farmer's wife carried out something more astonishing. Steaming bowls of stew, thick with potatoes, carrots, and beef. The aroma alone was enough to unman the prisoners. Their stomachs clenched, their throats tightened, and their dignity dissolved as bowls were passed into their hands. Some muttered curt words of thanks in broken English, others only bowed their heads, the act of eating itself already humiliating enough. But the taste, rich, hearty, alive with flavor, brought tears to one man's eyes. He hid them quickly, but the others noticed. No one mocked him. They understood. The farmer spoke little. When he did, his words carried a laconic humor that both disarmed and unsettled. "Strange world, ain't it?" he remarked, glancing at the medals on one man's chest. "One day you're giving orders. Next you're sitting in my yard eating my wife's stew." The Americans chuckled. The Germans did not. The truth cut too deeply. Still, the remark lingered, not as mockery, but as a reminder. The world had shifted on its axis, and power no longer belonged to those who once commanded it. As dusk settled, lamps were lit in the farmhouse windows, casting a golden glow across the yard. The generals sat together, full for the first time in weeks, yet restless. What was this hospitality? Mercy? Mockery? Or something more dangerous? An attempt to humanize them, to remind them they were not monsters, but men? They feared the erosion of the armor they had built within themselves. Hatred had been easier. It allowed them to justify the war, the losses, the ruin. But bread and stew complicated the narrative. Kindness, unexpected and undeserved, unsettled the soul more than any rifle muzzle. Later, as the guards herded them toward the barn where cots had been arranged, the farmer lingered at the fence, watching them file past. He removed his hat, scratched his head, and muttered almost to himself, "Guess everyone's just hungry, no matter what flag they carried." It was not a grand speech, not a declaration of philosophy, just a farmer's truth spoken into twilight. But the words burrowed into the generals' minds like seeds into soil, too simple to ignore, too human to dismiss. Inside the barn, they lay awake on rough cots, listening to the creak of wooden beams, the shuffle of cattle nearby, the whisper of wind through gaps in the boards. It was not a prison of iron or stone, but it held them all the same. Yet what bound them tighter than fences or guards was the strangeness of mercy. They had expected cruelty, and instead found themselves indebted to the generosity of strangers. Their pride resisted, but their hearts could not entirely deny the relief. In that uneasy space between gratitude and humiliation, between suspicion and bewilderment, they began to sense that their captors were playing a different game, one not fought with bullets or bombs, but with bread, blankets, and decency. As they drifted toward restless sleep, one thought settled among them like a shadow. If this was only the beginning, what would come next? The answer, they would soon discover, was even stranger than kindness. For their enemies were preparing not only to feed them, but to invite them to dinner. The invitation came without ceremony, a simple command from one of the guards. "Inside! Supper!" The Germans hesitated, exchanging glances, suspicion tightening their throats. Supper? Surely they had misheard. Prisoners of war ate in mess tents or behind barbed wire, not in the homes of their captors. Yet the guards gestured firmly, rifles at the ready, and the generals, men who once commanded armies, found themselves stepping across the porch of a farmhouse that smelled of bread, onions, and something roasting in the oven. The contrast was dizzying. Only weeks earlier, they had sat in command tents beneath banners, their words carrying the weight of life and death. Now, they entered like awkward guests, unsure if they were walking into mercy or mockery. The dining room was warm, lamplight spilling across a long wooden table scarred by years of meals and work. At its center rested bowls of potatoes, platters of meat, a loaf of bread still steaming, its crust split from the oven's heat. Plates had been set with simple care. No silver, only sturdy crockery worn smooth by use. The farmer's wife moved briskly between kitchen and table, her apron brushing her knees, her hair pinned back in a way that revealed both fatigue and quiet dignity. The children hovered nearby, instructed to behave but unable to resist staring at the strange guests in their home. Their eyes fixed on the medals, the uniforms, the rigid posture of men who seemed as out of place in that room as wolves among sheep. The generals sat stiffly, uncertain whether to remove their caps, uncertain whether such customs still applied to men stripped of authority. The farmer settled into his chair at the head of the table, his presence steady but not domineering. He motioned with a tilt of his chin, and the Germans sat. Silence pressed in from all sides, thick as smoke. The clink of a spoon against a bowl sounded louder than artillery. The Americans ate with the easy rhythm of men accustomed to hard work and hearty meals, while the Germans picked at their portions, torn between hunger and humiliation. Each bite tasted of surrender, every swallow an admission that they were dependent on those they once called enemies. At first, no one spoke. The generals stared at their plates, the Americans at their food, the farmers' children at everything. It might have remained that way, a meal consumed in silence, had the farmer not leaned back in his chair and asked, almost casually, "So, what's it like, losing a war?" The room froze. A child snickered before being silenced by a sharp glance from his mother. The Germans stiffened, faces tightening with fury or shame. It was a cruel question, delivered without cruelty, like a man curious about the weather. One of the generals, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched, finally muttered, "It is not something to discuss at dinner." His English was halting, but the meaning was clear. The farmer gave a small shrug, as if to say, "Fair enough," and reached for another slice of bread. The tension eased, but only slightly. Gradually, fragments of conversation emerged, not about battles or ideology, but about crops, about weather, about the long journey home that none knew if they would ever make. The farmer spoke of wheat yields, of winters that froze cattle in the fields, of summers so dry that even corn curled in the stalks. To the Germans, it was bewildering. Here was a man whose land was untouched by bombs, who fought battles not with armies, but with soil, rain, and markets. And yet his struggles, in their way, seemed just as relentless as campaigns across Europe. One general, older and less guarded, found himself nodding as the farmer described the unpredictability of weather. "War is like that too," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You prepare, you plan, and then something changes. Always, something changes." His words fell into the silence like stones into a pond, rippling outward. The children broke the tension again, whispering questions their mother tried to hush. Were they really soldiers? Did they fight against Daddy's friends? Why do they look so sad? Their innocence disarmed the generals more than any interrogation could. One boy, no older than 10, pointed at a medal pinned to a general's chest. "Did you get that for being brave?" The general's throat tightened. He had received it for commanding men who never returned from Stalingrad. He wanted to tell the boy that bravery sometimes meant nothing, that medals could not warm the dead. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "Yes, for being brave." The boy nodded solemnly, satisfied, and reached for more potatoes. With each passing minute, the absurdity deepened. These men had come expecting scorn, perhaps even death, and instead they were folded into the rhythms of a family supper. The farmer passed dishes without hesitation. His wife refilled cups with quiet efficiency. The children squabbled softly over bread crusts. It was, in its essence, an ordinary evening. Yet for the Germans, it was extraordinary, almost unbearable in its normality. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty, to steel themselves against vengeance. Instead, they found themselves treated not as monsters, but as men. The irony stung sharper than any insult. It forced them to confront a question they had long avoided. If their enemies could show mercy, what did that say about their own choices? For one general, the meal became a mirror. He had once dined in Paris, in Warsaw, in Kiev, at tables laden with conquered wealth. He had drunk wine taken from cellars emptied by soldiers, eaten delicacies seized from pantries of the defeated. Those meals had been symbols of power. This one, plain and modest, stripped him bare. Here bread was not a trophy but a gift. Soup was not spoils but sustenance. He realized, with a pang that felt like betrayal to his pride, that this humble table carried more dignity than all the banquets of conquest combined. Conversation resumed, halting but persistent. A guard mentioned his parents' German ancestry, his grandmother's sauerkraut recipe. The generals shifted, unsettled by the revelation. How could their enemies share their blood, their traditions, their food? The line between us and them blurred at the edges, refusing to hold. One American even joked, "Maybe you boys could teach us how to make real strudel before you go." Laughter followed. Awkward, uneven, but real. The Germans did not laugh, but they did not protest. The absurdity was complete. As the meal drew to a close, plates empty, the silence that settled over the table was no longer hostile but contemplative. The farmer leaned back, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of bread. "Strange world," he said softly, echoing words he had spoken before. "Men fight, men die, but in the end, everybody's gotta eat." His wife cleared the dishes, the children yawned, and the generals sat still, each lost in thoughts they dared not voice. The clash at that table had not been of weapons or words, but of worlds colliding. Pride against humility, hatred against hospitality, ideology against humanity. And though no verdict was spoken, the Germans felt the balance shifting, not with force, but with something subtler, more dangerous. They rose at last, escorted back toward the barn, their boots creaking against wooden floors. Yet the meal lingered in their minds like the taste of stew on the tongue, impossible to forget. What had begun as humiliation had transformed into something else, something they could not yet name. But they knew, with a clarity sharper than any command, that tonight's battle had not been fought on a field, but across a dinner table. And tomorrow they would face its consequences in ways they had never imagined. The night after the dinner, sleep came in fragments. The barn creaked with the wind, cows shifted heavily in their stalls, and the generals lay on their cots with eyes fixed on rafters that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Their bodies were fed, but their minds churned restlessly. They had expected interrogation, cruelty, perhaps death. Instead, they had been invited into a home, offered food prepared with care, and treated with a civility that unsettled them more than barbed wire ever could. For men trained to think in absolutes, victory or defeat, strength or weakness, the ambiguity gnawed at them. Morning light revealed no torture, no triumphant jeers, only the ordinary rhythm of farm life. The farmer and his children carried buckets to the well. The wife hung linens to dry. The guards leaned against fences, sipping coffee. The generals watched, hollowed by a realization more profound than the collapse of the Reich. Their enemies were not the caricatures they had been taught to despise. They were human, maddeningly ordinary, and in their ordinariness lay a strength that could not be mapped or measured. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. Bread shared, stew ladled, casual remarks exchanged between gulps of coffee. The farmer never delivered speeches about democracy, never lectured about freedom or justice. Instead, he offered something quieter but far more subversive: hospitality. In that simplicity, the generals sensed a weapon more enduring than rifles. The suggestion that dignity could survive even amid enmity, that humanity might triumph where ideology had failed. One general, whose bitterness had once been volcanic, found himself staring at the farmer's children as they argued over chores. Their innocence was a mirror he could not turn from. He had sent boys younger than these into the infernos of the Eastern Front. He had watched them vanish beneath artillery fire, their names forgotten in the machinery of war. To see American children laughing without fear, secure in a home unscarred by bombing, forced him to confront the abyss of his own choices. He felt shame rise like bile, yet also relief, because here, in this farmhouse, the cycle of cruelty had not been repeated. The others wrestled with similar thoughts. They had believed their capture would be defined by humiliation. Instead, they were offered the unbearable weight of kindness. It cracked their armor in ways bullets never could. To accept stew from the hands of a farmer's wife was to acknowledge dependence, and dependence meant vulnerability. Yet, within that vulnerability, a different truth emerged: that the world they had sought to dominate was larger, steadier, and more merciful than the one they had built. The farmer himself remained an enigma. He asked few questions, offered fewer judgments. His silence was not ignorance, but a choice, as though he understood that dignity required no speeches. Once, while mending a fence, he glanced toward the barn and called out almost casually, "A man's worth isn't only in what he fights for, but in how he treats those he beats." The words struck harder than any tribunal. They echoed among the Germans like scripture, because they were not spoken by a general, a president, or a priest, but by a man who smelled of hay and sweat, whose power came not from guns, but from decency. When the transfer orders finally arrived, the generals felt an unexpected pang of reluctance. They had feared this place upon arrival, despised its simplicity, but now the prospect of leaving unsettled them. The farmhouse, the meals, the quiet civility, it had shown them a crack of light in the narrative of vengeance they had braced themselves to endure. They knew that what awaited them in larger camps, in interrogations, perhaps even in tribunals, would not carry the same gentleness. But they also knew that the memory of this farm would cling to them, a stubborn reminder that even in the ashes of defeat, there had been mercy. As they boarded the trucks, the children waved. One boy, bold with youth, shouted, "Good luck!" The words startled the Germans. Luck? It seemed absurd. They were prisoners, disgraced, stripped of honor. Yet the boy had meant it sincerely, and sincerity pierced more deeply than sarcasm ever could. One of the generals raised a hand in return, the gesture awkward but genuine. It was the only salute he could offer now, not of power, but of gratitude. The convoy rumbled down the road, the farmhouse shrinking into the horizon. Inside the truck, silence reigned, but it was a silence thick with thought rather than despair. The generals carried no weapons, no authority, only memories. The sound of spoons clinking in bowls, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of lamplight on a wooden table. These were not the images they had expected to bear from captivity, yet they burned into them with the permanence of scars. In later years, some would recall those nights with astonishment, even reverence. They would admit in memoirs or private conversations that it was not fear that undid them, but kindness. For the United States, such treatment was no accident. The Geneva Conventions were honored not merely from law, but from strategy. To show mercy was to claim moral superiority, to wield compassion as proof that democracy could conquer tyranny not only on the battlefield, but in the heart. The dinner table became propaganda stronger than pamphlets or broadcasts, a silent demonstration that strength need not always roar, it could also serve. Quietly, bread and stew. For the generals, the lesson was more personal. They had seen the Reich fall, their armies crushed, their symbols desecrated. Yet what haunted them most was not the sight of their flags burning, but the image of a farmer's wife passing them potatoes as though they were simply men, weary and hungry, no different from her neighbors. That act stripped away layers of hatred more effectively than any cross-examination could. It revealed the frailty of ideology when confronted with humanity. As the trucks rattled farther from the farm, one general whispered into the roar of the engine, barely audible even to himself. Perhaps this is how wars truly end, not with guns, but with tables. The words hung in the stale air, unacknowledged yet undeniable. For all of them, the memory of that table would endure as both wound and balm. And beyond the horizon, in the silence of a farmhouse kitchen, The dishes had already been washed, the lamp extinguished, and the ordinary rhythm of life resumed, proof that mercy could be as unshakable as stone.